I firstly say that it's a tremendous privilege for me and for my team to welcome everyone here today. It was a pretty tough decision for us to decide, would this go ahead? Because obviously the logistics take a number of months to get in place. And I think we decided to make the decision we would drive ahead with the event after cancelling it 2 years in a row back in December. So an amazing achievement by the team. We have a tremendous lineup of speakers today and panelists and subject matter experts a lot of whom have flown in from around the globe, and they're going to share with you their own unique insights and perspectives on many interesting topics. Cybersecurity, cybercrime, cyber warfare, obviously, which is very prevalent in the day we now live in, artificial intelligence, machine learning, data regulation, and much, much more. So it's going to be a fascinating day for listening to the dialogue, but also from a networking perspective. And many of the participants, like you, are responsible for protecting their own organizations, protecting their networks, their clouds, their applications, their infrastructure, their people, their data, their intellectual property. But before I introduce the first set of speakers, I get 10 minutes, so I got to be quick, to maybe reflect on some of the macro themes that have affected the industry and the world from a cybersecurity perspective over the last 2 years. Now, normally I only have to consolidate 12 months into the opening gambit of Zero Day Con. This time I have to do 2 years. But what a 2 years it's been. When you look at the scale of the problem from a cyber perspective, it really is unprecedented. Obviously, it starts with the COVID-19 pandemic, and this was remarkable. It was an unprecedented event, and it altered the lives of billions of people around the globe. And it resulted in what's commonly now referred to as the new normal. The societal norms that we're all used to in how we work and how we live and how we engage and how we interact went out the window. Everything changed. But aside from how it affected our lives and our businesses, it had an incredibly profound impact on cybersecurity and cybercrime. You could argue that the coronavirus pandemic created the perfect petri dish that allowed cybercrime to flourish at an unprecedented rate. See, you got to understand, and I think you all do understand, that when people are in a heightened state of anxiety, they're much more susceptible to click on the link, or they're much more susceptible to go down the rabbit hole of misinformation. And the bad guys latched onto this brilliantly, absolutely brilliantly. I would say far better than the cybersecurity industry did, and they capitalized. And that was borne out both at a consumer level, but also at a governmental level, and also at a corporate enterprise level. And there's not a man or woman in this building who didn't have a brush with that. You got the text message from Amazon, from FedEx, from DHL, your package was missing. You had to pay tax on Brexit. You got the missed call from Azerbaijan or Albania. It was phishing, it was business email compromise, it was invoice fraud redirection, it was sextortion, it was extortion, it was money muling, it was money laundering. It was the most seedy underbelly of the internet we had ever seen, and it was relentless. On one hand, we were taking calls from consumers who'd lost everything, and this stuff really wasn't getting headline news. And on the other hand, we were getting calls from hospitals with all of their data deleted, which was pretty profound. But there was a high degree of sophistication to this as well. Early in the pandemic, we saw the first wave of supply chain attacks, and I know that the CISOs in this room and the people responsible for hardening the defenses of large organizations shudder when they think about this. The SolarWinds hack was the largest cybersecurity problem of the 21st century. And how we found out about it was as surprising as it was alarming, because one of the best companies in cybersecurity, FireEye, announced they had been breached. And when they retrospectively, forensically analyzed what happened, they found that a Russian espionage organization had successfully infiltrated their defenses in a very sophisticated manner. They bypassed all of their security, all of their monitoring, and they got to the core of their network. And they had done it under the guise of the SolarWinds technology because they had hacked the source code. This was a huge problem, and it was a massive wake-up call to the industry globally. Every company in this room uses open source technology. Every company in this room uses third-party suppliers to power their business, to drive operational efficiencies. And now, all of a sudden, these become the risk. And downstream from SolarWinds, 18,000 customers around the world were hacked. So you've got an enemy state who now have access to the most crucial information in government agencies throughout the globe. The scale was unbelievable. But, and you'll hear IBM speak about this later, other supply chain attacks were not so much about espionage, they were about commercialization. And Kaseya was an interesting one. What this demonstrated was lax approach to hardening of your systems, to patching of vulnerabilities, has dire consequences. Funnily, I was engaged by the US government to help with the Kaseya attack, and we looked at the scale of it and we said, it's too big for us, we can't help. There's too many people affected, and the fallout is incredible. The attack was conducted by Revil, the notorious ransomware gang, and they published on their blog, I think they call it Happy Blog, that they had infected 1 million devices. And this was simply because Kaseya had not patched the vulnerability, and the bad guys struck before they did. Overnight, it felt like to us the game had changed. You'll hear a lot about ransomware today, but ransomware was no longer the problem. The problem was now the data. We are now entering into a realm of what we call double extortion, where the bad guys know and they realize that companies are getting better at disaster recovery, business continuity, data backup. So they had to get the data. And then once they got the data, they could blackmail them, which worked incredibly successfully. And we saw companies overnight paying because they knew the data was being weaponized. And the lines were being blurred between ransomware and data breaches. You have the collision of two worlds all of a sudden. And when you talk about double extortion, in our mind, it was triple extortion, because while these guys were negotiating with us on one hand to sell them, give them Bitcoin for decryption keys, they were threatening, on the other hand, to decipher and disseminate the data. But on the other hand, they were also blackmailing individuals whose data that they had stolen. It was an incredibly stressful situation for organizations who found themselves in this predicament, and therefore they paid. So overnight, the bad guys made billions, and I mean billions, and people don't realize the scale of what they make. A great example would have been the Colonial Pipeline in North America, critical infrastructure. They paid within a couple of hours. Now, they managed to recoup that money. It's some great work by the US government, but they still paid. And many other companies that flew under the radar paid. This was a national emergency in several states in the US where you saw people queuing up because they couldn't access gas to fill their cars. And obviously, we got a front row seat here in Ireland. We were in the main show. In the midst of a pandemic, our entire health service was successfully hacked. Now, when they hacked the HSE, they very, very successfully got access to the network through a phishing email. They navigated their way around the network. They figured out where all of the voluntary and the statutory hospitals were. They traversed their way across the network, got in, found the data, stole it, encrypted, and created pandemonium. That was the Conti ransomware gang, who subsequently were hacked 2 weeks ago, and it now transpires that they were actually run by the Russian government, who gave us the keys to decrypt. So that's a whole interesting, different discussion that we can have some other time. But it just shows the scale of this problem. And very importantly, what we now understand about cybersecurity, and I think most of you here will understand it as well, is that you're not fighting one adversary, you're not fighting one nation state. You are fighting an entire ecosystem. And at every stage of that ecosystem, from the beginning to the end, you're fighting the best of the best. You're fighting the best penetration testers. You're fighting the guys who are best at building botnets. You're fighting the guys who are best at phishing campaigns. You're fighting the guys who are the best at navigating a network to circumvent your security tools and turn off monitoring devices. You're fighting the most scrupulous criminals. And these guys interact in a marketplace where they build affiliate programs, they do revenue share, and when you have a guy and he gets a foothold within a media organization or a utility company or an oil and gas company, he goes up the value chain in terms of selling his access, and these guys split it out. So the scale of the problem is incredibly profound because you're fighting the best at every stage. I would argue that the ransomware guys who come in at the end and kind of get the glory and the notoriety are really just the scrupulous criminals. They've just leaned and taken the value out of the ecosystem, who are the more technical guys down the stream who don't actually want to end up in prison in the US or wherever. So the ecosystem and the marketplace that is enabling this to happen is now well funded, they're very rich, and they're extremely dangerous. So it is worrying times. And then, again, for my CISO friends in the audience here, you pile on massive vulnerabilities where you don't even know where they are across a massive global infrastructure that can allow people to exploit and get access. You compound the problem. And Log4j is a perfect example of that. And I know there's still many people in the room scrambling to understand where those vulnerabilities are. I'm nearly out of time, so I got to hurry up. But I want to finish up and I want to talk about the conflict in Ukraine. And I have a lot of staff who are from the Ukraine and also from Russia, and it's an absolutely terrible situation. And I think Putin's war probably is the most acute cyber risk that Western governments and businesses have ever faced. The invasion is leading to incredibly punitive and severe sanctions on the Russian people. And the general consensus is that as Russia becomes more of a pariah state as a result of these sanctions, that they will respond asymmetrically with their very significant cyber capability. So what does a cyber war look like? There's precedent for this. In 2017, the NSA in the US were hacked, and they had built up an arsenal of zero-day vulnerabilities to use against their adversaries. Shadow brokers were the group that hacked them, and they dumped these vulnerabilities on the dark web for anybody to use. The first to mobilize was Kim Jong-un, North Korea. They built WannaCry. They targeted the UK and Spain, and that spread out to be a massive, massive problem globally. But a few weeks later, Russia did the same. They mobilized. They took the zero-day vulnerability, MS-17101, I think, and they effectively weaponized it to attack Ukraine. The problem is this wiper malware spread out of control. It spilled over the borders, and it, due to the interconnectivity of the world we now live in, it affected organizations globally at an incredibly profound rate. It infected 150 countries. It infected hundreds of thousands of assets and massive organizations like MSD and the Danish shipping giant Maersk, and it became a huge, huge problem. What we learned from that is that while governments can protect nuclear bombs and weapons of mass destruction, they're not very good at protecting destructive digital assets like zero-day vulnerabilities. We also learned that this represents a massive capability in the escalation of cyber attacks, and that the ability to contain this is a real problem. Now, while in this conflict, there's no massive zero-day vulnerability like the Microsoft vulnerability for NotPetya and WannaCry, there is wormable wiper malwares being developed to target the Ukraine. And the problem is, it's only a matter of time before these spill over the borders and before we see the fallout from this. Not to mention the asymmetric attacks that we are going to face coming down the line. So it is a very uncertain time. It's a very nervous time for anybody in cybersecurity. And I think you could now argue, and I think some of our panelists might talk about it today, that we are now truly entering the grey war, the cyber war. And in that cyber war, the benefits are, it is very difficult to assign attribution. It's very difficult to define who exactly did it. While intelligence agencies will have a good indication of who has done it, it is still difficult to effectively nail it down.